Hi, everybody. My name is Karen Ellsworth, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees of the Elam Museum of Art and Culture. Welcome to our final program in our spring lecture series. A few notes before we start. Please turn off your video and your audio during the program because it will save bandwidth and it will prevent background noise. When the presentation is finished, John is going to take questions, so you can unmute yourself if you need to ask a question. If you're on a telephone, press *6 to unmute yourself and press *9 to raise your hand if you have a question. I'm going to now turn this over to Lisa Fiore, who is the president of the Board of Trustees of the museum, and she is going to introduce our speaker. Unmute yourself, Lisa. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Peacedale Museum of Art and Culture. I'm Lisa Fiore, president of the board, and my involvement with the museum is enjoyable and rewarding because I work with a wonderful group of like-minded individuals who volunteer to keep history alive and well. Together, we are tasked with preserving and sharing with the public this 129-year-old international and multicultural collection. A visit to our museum gallery is certainly worth the trip. Shout out to Karen Ellsworth, fellow trustee and creator of our excellent newsletter, who is responsible for this interesting spring lecture series as well. Good to know that this lecture, along with presentations from last fall, have been recorded and are available on our museum website, peacedalemuseum.org. Anyone not on our museum mailing list but would like to be, please email us and we will add you to our constant contact and newsletter list. Our speaker tonight, John Peixinho, has been intrigued by Vaucluse, Thomas R. Hazard's home in Portsmouth, ever since his grandmother took him to see Mrs. Ryan's Jersey cows when he was 5 years old. John is a native Rhode Islander, a URI graduate, and the owner of Franklin & Company Design Associates, a Newport-based residential design and management firm specializing in the restoration, renovation, and decoration of historic properties. He is a former member and chairman of the Newport Historic District Commission and is currently a trustee of the Preservation Society of Newport County, where he serves as chairman of the Collections Committee. John divides his time between his primary home in Middletown, a schoolhouse built in 1794, and the 17th century Samuel Clark Farm in Richmond, where he is restoring the 8 historic structures. John spoke about his restoration of the Clark Farm during our fall 2019 lecture series. We are delighted to welcome him back to the museum. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Karen. I haven't included any credits on the slides this evening, but I've compiled a list, and if anyone would like a copy, you can contact the Peacedale Museum or me directly for that list. So Thomas Robinson Hazard was born on January 3rd, 1797 on Tower Hill in South Kingstown in the house of his paternal grandfather. In those days, there were so many Hazards in South County, and specifically so many Tom Hazards, that they were given nicknames to differentiate them from each other. Thomas Robinson Hazard's grandfather was known as College Tom because he attended Yale, and there was also a Bedford Tom and a Virginia Tom, a Nailer Tom, and even a Pistol Head Tom. As a boy, young Thomas was given 2 otter sheep, and because of his exceptional care of the animals and his subsequent focus on sheep farming, he was given the nickname Shepherd Tom. This name suited him, and unlike most nicknames, it pleased him, and it followed him throughout his life. Shepherd Tom was born of the 7th generation of Hazards in Rhode Island. He was keenly interested in his family history and Hazard Robinson genealogy. He was descended from Thomas Hazard I, who emigrated from England, and by 1639 had moved to Portsmouth with his wife, Mary Brownell, and his 4-year-old son, Robert. Robert would become Shepherd Tom's 3rd great-grandfather. By 1671, Robert Hazard had settled in South County. He purchased 500 acres of land and built a house in the Mooresfield section of South Kingstown. Shepherd Tom was the son of Roland and Mary Peace Hazard. The Hazards were Quakers. Mary Peace was born in Charleston, South Carolina. He was the 2nd oldest of 9, 5 brothers and 4 sisters. Father Roland's fortunes appear to have been up and down throughout much of his lifetime. But around the year 1800, Roland suffered serious financial losses associated with his interests in mercantile shipping. As a result, he soon tried textile manufacturing, and by 1805, he was operating a mill in South Kingstown in the area that we now know as Peacedale, named for his wife, Mary Peace. And for those visiting from Newport tonight, Peacedale is a village in Washington County. It is south of 138 and just north of downtown Wakefield. For about 150 years, Peacedale was the financial and psychological center of the Hazard family universe. As the mill grew and the family prospered, the Hazards improved the village. They constructed artistically designed buildings and bridges, all set amid tree-lined streets. The Hazards were firmly committed to enhancing the quality of life of the mill workers and the inhabitants of Peacedale. What evolved was a charming, picturesque environment very different from most 19th century New England mill villages. The Hazard family houses were located at Peacedale as well. In varying degrees and at different times, each of the Hazard brothers was involved in the operation of the mills. However, Isaac and Roland were really responsible for the day-to-day management of Peacedale and its growth and success. That's Brother Roland on the left. Brother Joseph, and Isaac on the right. Brother Joseph was without doubt the most unusual and eccentric member of this generation. He was keenly interested in the occult and the supernatural and believed he was clairvoyant. He kept detailed journals and built houses and other structures based on dreams and communication from spirits. Shepherd Tom's early schooling included 3 years at the Westtown Quaker School in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Following this, he returned to Peacedale and went to work for his father. At the age of 12, Shepherd Tom was given the task of delivering rolls of wool to houses throughout South County. The textile manufacturing business was still in its infancy in Rhode Island. He recalls, in those days, the wool was carted into rolls at Peacedale and transported to and from on the backs of horses, there not then being a 4-wheeled wagon in the town. We used to employ scores, and I may say hundreds of families, to spin and weave on single-hand spinning wheels and hand looms. These were in their own homes, which were widely scattered over Washington County. So within a designated period of time, Shepherd Tom would return to the workers' houses and collect the wool and piece goods. Within a few years, the increased use of machinery and the centralization of the entire weaving process made this cottage industry obsolete and created a very profitable business for the Hazards. The process of delivery and collection to and from Peacedale brought Shepherd Tom into contact with many of the early inhabitants of South County. He seems to have explored every village, hamlet, and homestead. He exchanged the news of the day for tales of folklore and the early history of Rhode Island. These oral traditions would later form the basis for his popular writings. At the age of 21, Shepherd Tom bought 10 acres of land in the Rocky Brook area adjacent to Peacedale. He acquired the right to build a dam and flood another 10 acres nearby. There, he built his own small woolen manufactory, and soon he purchased an adjoining 70 acres. He combined the operation of his factory with farming and raising sheep, and kept herds numbering up to 1,200 at any given time. Meanwhile, the Peacedale textile industries grew. All of this allowed him to comfortably retire from active business before the age of 40. This is Shepherd Tom, painted around 1835 by Jane Stewart, Gilbert Stuart's daughter. So just at about the time he retired from business. This is the Quaker Tom Robinson house on Washington Street in Newport, with its beautiful colonialized interior. It was here that Shepherd Tom began his courtship of one of the Robinson granddaughters, Frances Minturn. By contemporary accounts, she was one of the most celebrated beauties of the day. Frances was the daughter of Esther Robinson and Jonas Minturn. Jonas was a successful New York merchant, and like the Robinson family, also had South County roots. The Minturns lived in New York, but spent part of each year in Newport at the Robinson house. On October 12, 1837, Frances and Shepherd Tom were married in New York City. 2 weeks later, the newlywed Hazards boarded a brigantine packet ship and embarked on an extensive European honeymoon. On the left is a packet ship of about 1830, and on the right is a sketch of a typical private cabin. Shepherd Tom describes their journey. We took passage accompanied by two of my own sisters in the packet ship Quebec for London, where we arrived via Portsmouth in about 20 days. After passing a few days in London, we proceeded to Paris via Dover and Boulogne, where we stayed about a month. Here, I purchased a carriage in which we traveled by post to Rome, by way of Lyon, Marseille, Toulon, Nice, the Maritime Alps, and Genoa. On our arrival at Rome, we took rooms at the Russian Hotel and engaged a hack or carriage and suitable driver for a month, that we might visit the objects of interest in and around the city. Shepherd Tom made several trips to Europe in his lifetime. Trips of this sort were not usual in 1837. Packet ships were definitely not ocean liners. Sea and overland travel was extremely difficult and unpredictable. This trip tells us much about the Hazards' fortitude and socioeconomic status, as well as what must have been a keen desire to see the world, all at a time when most Rhode Island inhabitants rarely ventured more than a few miles from their homesteads. A few months earlier, in July of 1837, and in preparation for his marriage, Shepherd Tom had purchased a large farm in South Portsmouth called Vaucluse. At that time, Vaucluse was already well known as a showplace. By every account, it was then the largest and most conspicuous of all the country seats on Aquidneck Island. I'm going to digress here briefly to tell you a little about Vaucluse before we return to the Hazards. The farm was originally established about 1770 by a British merchant named Gervase Elam. The Elams were Quakers and natives of Leeds, England. In order to maintain their substantial business interests in the colonies, one family member lived here at all times. Gervase Elam died in 1777, and his property was acquired by his nephew Samuel. This map of the bay was made in 1777. Vaucluse is here, right here on the east side of the island, at the red circle on the Saconnet shore. So here's Aquidneck Island, Newport, Middletown, Portsmouth, and Vaucluse. At this time, rich Newport merchants, like the Elams, would maintain a townhouse, often on Thames Street or Washington Street, and a farm in the adjoining countryside. The other surnames on the map indicate the locations of many of these early farms. In the days before dependable transportation and grocery stores, these country seats afforded space for stables and barns and provided produce, food, and livestock for the owners' townhouses. Newport families also spent the summer months at their farms when the town was hot and the streets dusty and crowded. Samuel Elam's brick townhouse was located on the east side of Thames Street in Newport, where the main post office is today. Elam owned a large wharf and warehouses just across Thames Street. In addition to his mercantile interests, he founded the Rhode Island Union Bank and also established the Newport Insurance Company. He was a member of the Rhode Island General Assembly and had a reputation for generosity and philanthropy. This is the southernmost part of Aquidneck Island, painted in 1860 by George Champlin Mason, and now owned by the Redwood Library. The view is from the hill just above Bailey's Beach, looking west toward Jamestown and the Narragansett shore. At this time, just exactly as it had been 80 years earlier, the island was nearly treeless. The trees that hadn't been removed by the colonists were cut down completely by the occupying British forces for firewood between 1776 and 1779. Once the trees were gone, the British troops pulled down approximately 300 frame houses and used them for fuel as well. And if you don't believe me, here's an early 20th century view looking from Green End Hill in Middletown across what is now the reservoir, and that's St. George's School up there at the top on the crest of the hill. Through the 1930s, much of the island looked like this, just as it had for over 200 years. Through the 1790s, Newport was still feeling the effects of the British occupation and the Revolution. Commerce was at a standstill. Many merchants and tradesmen decamped for Boston and New York. The island economy was devastated for decades. But unlike its many impoverished residents, Samuel Elam was successful, and he lived and entertained on a grand scale. When not in town for business and banking days, we know that Samuel spent much of his time in the country. The Duc de Rochefoucauld-Liancourt visited him there in 1796 and published a book about his travels in America in 1799. He wrote, "Samuel Elam is the best of Quakers and the worthiest of men. He is a bachelor, rich, fond of trade, and of rural life. He is the only farmer on the island of Rhode Island who does not labor upon his own ground. The stone fences enclosing his fields are higher and better than any I have seen in Massachusetts. His meadows are in a state of improvement and fertility, which is considerably profitable." The Duke also noted that his friend Samuel lived in, quote, "a small, snug house," and that must have really struck a nerve. So between 1801 and 1803, with his fortune growing, Elam made major improvements to his farmhouse and grounds. Contemporary accounts record that he spent $80,000 embellishing his country estate, a literal fortune in those days, at a time when a day's wage for a laborer was 25 cents and the workday lasted from sunup to sundown. The old house that his uncle had built 30 years earlier became the core of the new structure. Elam created one of the first Neo-Palladian houses with flanking wings in the United States. So this will show you that basically the farmhouse that his uncle built in the 1770s, and then Elam expanded it like this to create the Vaucluse that he lived in. Then here's the original floor plan, and then Elam's additions. The west wing housed his extensive library, and the east wing contained the almost unknown luxury of an indoor privy. The high Doric portico that Elam built created an imposing presence and established Vaucluse as his temple in the woods. Remember, this was 20 years before the Greek revival would affect the appearance of antiquity for a new nation. The house faced south, and with the island practically treeless, I imagine that the views to and from Newport must have been astonishing. To soften the barren Aquidneck Island landscape, Samuel Elam imported numerous exotic plantings and specimen trees from England and beyond. This garden plan was drawn in the late 1920s, and it shows many of the remaining embellishments that Elam installed on the grounds in 1803. A 300-foot-long path led through formal gardens to the edge of the ravine. Overlooking this were 3 tea houses, or summer houses, all connected by boxwood edge gravel paths. Elam dammed the stream in the ravine and built what was described as an artificial pond. The pond was big enough for a small boat in season and for cutting ice in the winter. Contemporary accounts also recall his large boxwood maze and imported marble statues, pergolas, and arbors. To the north of the house were extensive apple and peach orchards. Now, about the name Vaucluse. With thanks to eBay, this is Samuel Elam's book plate. Samuel maintained an extensive and diverse library. We know he owned the works of Homer and Virgil, as well as books by contemporary authors of the day. He also read the work of this fellow, the Italian poet Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch. And in the 14th century, Petrarch lived in the French countryside near the city of Avignon at a place called Fontaine de Vaucluse. His house overlooked a beautiful valley and the river Sorgue below. Petrarch had fallen madly in love with a woman he called Laura. Sadly, Laura did not share Petrarch's affection. So with a broken heart, Petrarch retreated to Vaucluse. There he wrote over 300 sonnets to Laura and gained a permanent place in literary history. Samuel Elam, we are told, experienced a similar unrequited romance with the then reigning belle of Newport. Like Laura, with her true identity was never disclosed. So with a broken heart and in homage to his own melancholy, Elam named his own little valley and stream Vaucluse, and it remains Vaucluse to this day. Samuel was only able to enjoy his newly expanded house and grounds for about 10 years. He died in 1814 at the age of 63. By contemporary accounts, his princely entertainments and steady intake of rich food, brandy, and champagne finally caught up with him. He was buried in the Friends Burial Ground in Newport. I haven't found a likeness of Samuel, but this is his nephew and uncle's namesake, Gervase II. So perhaps there was a family resemblance. Gervase II was dispatched to Newport after Samuel's death. He liquidated Samuel's property and businesses and returned to England. Over the next 20 or so years, Vaucluse saw a succession of 4 owners. In 1837, the farm was again on the market, and Shepherd Tom, no doubt, read this very advertisement. It describes Vaucluse exactly as he found it. Here are a few high points. For sale, the valuable country seat and farm called Vaucluse, containing 142 acres of land of superior quality and having a valuable seaweed privilege, a large orchard with choice fruits and grapes, a mansion house, very elegant, containing 19 rooms with pantries, kitchens, wine, and billiard rooms. The pleasure grounds are extensive, with a great variety of foreign trees and shrubs of the rarest description, and a farmhouse, a stable, a coach house with harness room and fireplace, barns, sheds, cribs, a granary, and an ice house, and the greatest advantages for fishing, fowling, and sea bathing. So the Hazards returned to Rhode Island from their European honeymoon and took up residence at Vaucluse. Their first child, Mary, was born in 1839, but sadly she died at only 2.5 years of age. Between 1841 and 1848, 4 daughters followed. They were Frances, called Fanny, Gertrude, Anna, and Esther. The Hazards' only son, Barclay, was born in 1852. Contemporary accounts describe a happy, bucolic life at Vaucluse for the young family during these years. Maud Howe Elliott, the daughter of Julia Ward Howe, was a family friend and a nearby summer resident at her house, Oak Glen. Writing years later, she recalls the Hazard children. The Hazards had a curious wild flavor, like the alpine strawberries that grew at Vaucluse. Taken all together, they were the handsomest family I have ever seen. Besides their beauty and charm, they had certain characteristics that set them apart from the rest of us. They seemed to hold some secret knowledge and communion with nature that gave them a power over animals. They understood the languages of horses, dogs, even insects. They had no fear of any living thing. They knew snakes, bees, spiders, toads for their friends. They seemed more like a race of fauns and dryads than mere flesh and blood boys and girls. And during these years, Vaucluse was a model farm. An 1853 account notes, Mr. Hazard's garden contained 17 acres, most elegantly laid out, including a labyrinth with serpentine walks, a fit emblem of ancient Troy. The walks are spacious and present a charming and picturesque scenery. His farm consists of about 150 acres, scientifically cultivated. Mr. Hazard is a practical farmer. Everything indicates system and proper management, and a walk over his extensive grounds would soon convince the reader that we have not too highly colored the picture. So the peach and apple orchards flourished, and the melon patches thrived, and the large house was well suited for entertaining. Extended family visits were frequent. Now, while living at Vaucluse and as early as 1840, Shepherd Tom began promoting social reforms. He frequently provided politically motivated content to local and regional papers. He also wrote and self-published numerous pamphlets and books to promote his causes and campaigns. He was an ardent abolitionist and helped fund the American Colonization Society. This group advocated for the establishment of Liberia as a free Black nation and for the voluntary repatriation of formerly enslaved people. Shepherd Tom visited every poorhouse, insane asylum, and hospital in the state and wrote widely about the conditions that he found. His reports and advocacy were the basis for statewide reforms that soon followed. He actively promoted the women's suffrage movement, and he fought against capital punishment. He was also an early advocate for the humane treatment of animals, and throughout his lifetime, he focused on school conditions and specifically on improving literacy throughout the state. He also established the state's first night schools. Near Vaucluse, he built and funded the local school and district. Then in 1854, tragedy struck the young family. Shepherd Tom's wife, Frances, died. She was just 42 years old. Great-nephew Roland Hazard recalled later, "The death of Shepherd Tom's wife was the pivotal event in his life. It was a blow so cruel and crushing, and it fell upon a nature so gentle and loving that for years it changed his whole outlook. His mental vision became suddenly astigmatic." Frances Hazard was buried in the family cemetery high up on the south side of the ravine with their daughter Mary and Shepherd Tom's parents. Now, this photo of the Hazards was taken probably about 1860. From left to right are Anna, Barclay, Fanny, Shepherd Tom, and then standing behind him are Gertrude and Esther. Maud Howe Elliott, writing again in her memoirs years later, gives us a glimpse of daily life at Vaucluse shortly after Mr. Hazard's death. She writes, "It may have been that Mr. Hazard's exceeding grief for the loss of his wife made his heart tender to all her family, but I think rather that he was innately hospitable and liked to have his noble old colonial house with its shining white columns filled to overflowing." She also describes a day spent at Vaucluse as a child. "It was nearly supper time," she writes, "when family and friends were rounded up at Vaucluse for tea. The gong rang, and soon we were seated at the long mahogany table that stretched the length of that vast dining room. First, we had bread and butter. Airily thin, the bread was cut, and the butter was Vaucluse's own matchless brand. Then Johnny cakes, fried to a delicate brown. The yellow and green pineapple in the middle of the table miraculously opened, and there was the perfect condiment for Johnny cakes, granulated sugar mixed with powdered cinnamon. Keep a place for the peaches, a wise child warned the others. The peaches were sliced and served in cut glass saucers, eaten with thin old silver spoons that came into the family with the Robinson blood generations ago. At the head of the feast was Mr. Hazard, a big man with a loud voice, great bony hands, huge joints, strong heavy features, and blue eyes, the eyes of a mystic." She continues, "Later on the lower porch, beside the great columns, sat Mr. Hazard and some of the old people, talking the same silly stuff about materialization, spirit life, mediums, and psychic photographs. The Hazards all believed in the spirits that haunted Vaucluse. They had been brought up to believe in them." So seances, mediums, and materializations it was to be at Vaucluse. Following Mrs. Hazard's death in 1854, modern spiritualism entered the life of Shepherd Tom. No doubt he was influenced by his brother Joseph's early interest in spirit communications and the supernatural. By contemporary accounts, modern spiritualism began in 1848 following reports from Western New York State of strange phenomena associated with three sisters, Leah, Maggie, and Kate Fox. Accounts of ghostly rappings and messages from the other side were scooped up by the press and reported in newspapers throughout the country. The Fox sisters became celebrities, and numerous copycat spirit guides and mediums appeared practically overnight. Modern spiritualism found its biggest audience in the upper middle and upper class households of the day. Typically, a spirit medium was enclosed in a specially made cabinet or behind a curtain. During a seance, various messages were sent to the attendees from the spirit world, often in response to the participants' questions. When successful, bodily spirit manifestations and something called ectoplasm were displayed. Ectoplasm was often described as spirit lace. It seems to be a substance that oddly resembled cheesecloth or fine netting. The popularity of modern spiritualism was in part a response to the incidence of sickness, disease, and early death in the mid-19th century. As urban populations expanded, tuberculosis, or consumption as it was known, became a leading cause of death. The world was on the threshold of modern medicine, but a clear understanding of airborne pathogens and the widespread use of antibiotics were still years away. Over the next 20 years, each of the Hazard girls would become infected with tuberculosis, and three, Anna, Fanny, and Esther, would eventually die directly from the disease. Anna, on the left, died first in 1868, and then Fanny in 1877. She's on the right. And only a few months later, Gertrude, who was also suffering from TB, died by drowning. Years later, great-nephew Roland remembered, "Personally, I saw much of my uncle's grief, for I attended the last rites of at least three of my cousins and helped lay them in the family burial ground on the farm at Vaucluse after the old Rhode Island custom. There was a grim pathos about these occasions that impressed me mightily." The death of his girls and Shepherd Tom's firm belief in the afterlife led to more mediums and more seances. He spent time at the spiritualist community at Moravia, New York, and contributed frequently to their magazine, The Banner of Light. He also later participated in an extensive analytical study organized by the University of Pennsylvania. This was known as the Seibert Commission. Their scientific results exposed fraud and fakery in every area of spiritualist phenomenon. This did nothing to shake Shepherd Tom's beliefs. In fact, it strengthened his convictions. In 1883, Shepherd Tom published a book called Miscellaneous Essays and Letters. Several chapters give insight into what appear to be typical practices at Vaucluse during the late summer of 1879. He writes, "I have recently been present at 13 spiritual seances held on my own premises in the presence of Mrs. Mary Hull, who is probably one of the very best materializing mediums either in America or Europe, and who with her husband has been staying a few weeks at Vaucluse. 8 of the seances were conducted in the nursery of Vaucluse, so familiar, of course, to my deceased wife and children. On 5 evenings, all of my deceased daughters came repeatedly, as also did their mother and spirit friends. My wife and several of my daughters taking my arm and walking to the upper hall, and on one occasion descending to the foot of the stairs. On Sunday evening, the 24th of August, my wife came out of the cabinet, very lifelike and strong, and in so good a light it was impossible to mistake her identity. On this occasion, my wife first made or materialized a great quantity of fine lace, which she placed on my head and manipulated, no doubt, for healing or strengthening purposes. On some evenings, this lace was lit up with sparks, probably electric, which would snap as the lace was pressed on my head, imparting thereby electricity to my system. He continues, "The next seance was held at a summer house I keep locked night and day, the key in my desk. It is situated at the foot of a slightly descending broad gravel walk, some 320 feet from the front steps of my house. My wife, wearing on this occasion a tasty white walking dress, came from behind the curtains, walked to the door looking toward the house, and gazed fondly for some time at the old familiar place, now lit up by the bright full moon. My daughters, Fanny, Gertrude, Anna, and Mary then came in succession and gazed wistfully down the several shaded walks of the grounds." I apologize for the quality of this photo, but it's taken from a stereo view card made in the 1880s, and it shows the two paths leading east from the tea house porch. If you look just where the cursor is, you can see the column of the tea house right here. Over the next few weeks, the spirits would grow bolder, and they would lead Shepherd Tom along all the walks and through the grounds of the estate. While the descriptions of these events seem fantastical, they also tell us a great deal about his lingering grief. Now, it was also during this period that Shepherd Tom penned the two collections of folkloric tales for which he is best remembered. Recollections of Olden Times was a historical and genealogical survey of South County in the early 18th and 19th century. Chapters were linked by the story of the unfortunate Hannah Robinson. Poor Hannah had married the proverbial wrong guy against the advice of her imperious and strong-willed father. The old Narragansett countryside and snippets of its history are described in detail as Hannah leaves behind the squalor of Providence to travel to South County. Along the way, she rests briefly at a rock and lookout point, now named for her, and then makes a final journey to her ancestral family home, the Roland Robinson house off Boston Neck Road. Shepherd Tom next wrote a series of essays, now known as the Johnny Cake Papers. These essays were published weekly in the Providence Journal. Each installment featured humorous tales of the Narragansett countryside and its earliest inhabitants. These woodcuts were made for the handsome 1915 re-edition published by grandnephew Roland Hazard. The chapters are woven together with the story of Shepherd Tom's grandfather's cook, Phyllis, shown here, and his vivid descriptions of her famous, uniquely Rhode Island cuisine. At nearly every opportunity, he extols the virtues of the true Rhode Island Johnny Cake, made only of ground white flint corn, which he calls ambrosia, and baked before an open fire on a red oak barrelhead. Each chapter ends with the promise of discovering in the very next installment the tale of how Phyllis, in old Narragansett, was responsible for the French Revolution and the subsequent deaths of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette a whole world away. The tales were so popular that the Arkwright Meal Company stole Phyllis and used her supposed image as a marketing tool. Here we have the Arkwright Mills advertisement on the left, and on the right is a real Hazard family treasure, a redware dish inscribed Phyllis. In 1881, son Barclay Hazard married Alida Blake of Providence. Alida would later become somewhat famous in her own right as an advocate of the women's anti-suffragist movement. By the mid-1880s, Barclay was spending much of the year in Santa Barbara, California, where his Peacedale cousins spent the winter. The Hazard cousins built two houses near the old Santa Barbara Mission. These photos are of the smaller of the two, named Dial House, taken shortly after construction. This next photo is Dial House in recent years. Later, Barclay purchased the vast El Capitan Ranch just west of South Santa Barbara and a large schooner called the Ocean King. This he used for pleasure cruises and exploration of the nearby Channel Islands. His primary interest became the study of botany and unusual West Coast specimens. Shepherd Tom made several trips to California. In 1886, on his return east, he stopped in New York City, where he stayed at the then fashionable St. Denis Hotel. Quite suddenly, he was taken ill and died there on March 26th. He was 89 years old. By chance, Brother Joseph was with him at the time. Shepherd Tom was buried with his family at Vaucluse in the secluded cemetery he had laid out 50 years earlier. Barclay and Alida appear to have spent even less time at Vaucluse following Shepherd Tom's death. The rear of the house was occupied by a caretaker, and no improvements appear to have been made to the house or grounds. Soon, rumors began to circulate locally and eventually made their way into the regional press. In 1900, this article appeared in the Boston Globe. Vaucluse was called the Ghost House. The reporter noted, tabloid style, that, quote, before Mr. Hazard died, he requested that his body be buried in the grounds of his beautiful home, where he could leave his grave and wander at will and commune with his wife and son. The house is always open, as the spirits must have free access. It is their home and no one enters irreverently. Other newspaper stories go so far as to describe the caretaker's wife setting 12 places at the table each evening so that the Hazard ghost would always feel welcome. Maud Howe Elliott also fueled the origins of the local legend. She wrote, Vaucluse itself, haunted to the end by its gentle ghost, was left eventually to fall down bit by bit. Mr. Hazard willed it to his son Barclay, with the direction that it was to remain in the condition in which it was left. Barclay's eccentric interpretation of this clause was to allow the noble old house to stand vacant and untended, a dim white phantom among the close pressing tangle of the overgrown box maze and the forgotten garden. In reality, Shepherd Tom's will was all of 3 sentences long, and it contained no language about Vaucluse at all. Local and New York papers at the turn of the century also contain numerous accounts of the grounds at Vaucluse being used for picnics, most often by the Newport Summer Colony. I suspect this was done through arrangement with the caretaker. The 7-mile trip to Vaucluse allowed the Edwardian picnickers the chance to enjoy a ride through the outlying countryside, first in open carriages and later in their newfangled automobiles. Newport socialites Alva Belmont, Francis Burke Roach, and Tessie Ulrichs all gave noted picnic outings there. During the summer of 1905, a picnic for 50 was given there for Alice Roosevelt, the president's daughter. It was hosted by Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt and Mrs. John Jacob Astor, and it was headline news. By 1913, son Barclay was in serious financial trouble. This was apparently the result of his mismanagement of the estate of his last surviving aunt, Anna, and his own personal expenditures. It's likely that his precarious finances had more to do with the sorry condition of Vaucluse than its ghosts. To give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, his Aunt Anna's estate was then valued at $700,000. Conservatively adjusted for inflation, this would be about $18 million today. So his Hazard cousins in Peacedale stepped in and took control of his financial situation. Locally, they created the Rhode Island Estates Corporation to take ownership of his numerous real estate holdings. Surveys and proposed subdivisions were prepared to help market the properties. But for the next 24 years, Vaucluse was unable to find a new owner, and all the while the house fell down bit by bit. In the 1920s, a renewed interest in American antiques and architecture swept the country. In 1925, the Metropolitan Museum of Art removed paneling from the Metcalf Bowler House, then part of Vaucluse, that's shown on the right, and installed it in the American Wing, which is the photograph on the left. The following year, portions of the south facade of Vaucluse, including the front door and second floor window and balustrade, were removed by the Met for exhibition in New York. These photographs show them on display there. The next eerie photos show the poor old house, badly overgrown and slowly decaying. Boards cover the holes where the architectural features have been removed. The noted American architect John Russell Pope, then in the process of building his own summer house at Newport, struck a deal for the original gates. He had them removed and transported to his wife's family residence, Airlie, in Wilmington, North Carolina. These gates date to Samuel Elam's building campaigns of 1803. Here they are being reinstalled following restoration a few years ago. At about the same time, Alice Brayton, a Portsmouth resident, famous for the topiary gardens at her house Green Animals, became intrigued by Vaucluse. She commissioned the reconstructed garden plan that we saw earlier, and this eerie painting by Newport artist Dur Friedley of Vaucluse in moonlight. Today it remains in the dining room at Green Animals on loan from the Redwood Library. Miss Brayton wrote a charming historical essay for publication that was then being compiled, called Gardens of Colony and State. She writes, Vaucluse is now a ruin, where all the world rolled up in a coach and four, an occasional trespasser now squeezes through a gap in a wall of fieldstone and looks half frightened at the utter desolation of an 18th century dream. Hauntingly lovely, the falling house and the hedges of box, monstrous and neglected, still look south toward a romantic ravine down which a little brook runs quickly to the Saconnet River. Even tourist postcards like this view of the ravine were made in the 1920s and sold commercially. Then in the 1930s, the Historic American Building Survey, a branch of the WPA, arrived at Vaucluse by arrangement with the Hazard family. Two draftsmen spent several weeks measuring and drawing the old house. As a result, there are 26 pages of drawings measured right down to the doorknobs and preserved for posterity. In 1937, while living in Matunic, both Barclay and Alida Hazard died within several weeks of each other. And in that same year, Vaucluse was sold to George and Diana Ryan of Newport and New York, almost 100 years to the day that it had been bought by Shepherd Tom. Diana Ryan's family had been spending summers in Newport for many years. The Ryans found the old house well beyond any hope of repair. In the spring of 1938, they began construction of a large whitewashed brick house of more than 30 rooms, designed by New York architect Eldridge Snyder. The new house was located east of the site of the original house, closer to the shore, and it faced the river. Let me give you a quick tour of Vaucluse in 1938. This would have been the spring of 1938 when the house was under construction. The sheathing boards had just been bricked up, and this is probably the architect with an assistant or friend having a site view of the property. This is workmen when the house was under construction that same season. And I have an app that colorizes the picture, so it'll give you a better sense of each of these pictures of Vaucluse in the 30s and 40s. This is the main entrance court just after construction. This is the portico, the east portico facing the river. Again, the river side of the house. And this is the drawing room, Chinese wallpaper. Dining room. Library. And the gun room. During construction, the Ryans were able to negotiate with the Met for the return of the original front door. This was incorporated into the waterside elevation of the new house. One of the most novel features of the Ryan estate was the construction of a large brook-fed swimming pool. In magnitude, this in itself was on par with a WPA project. The swimming pool was irregularly shaped, about 280 feet long. It was built in the ravine at the location of Samuel Elam's artificial pond. These photos were taken to document damage shortly after the 1944 hurricane. The pool is 10 feet deep at the east end and 3 feet deep at the west. Also at the east end is a high stone-faced waterfall that was accessed by an arched bridge over a stone raceway. The pool was engineered and constructed so that with the removal of a plug and the turn of a valve, the flow of the stream that feeds the pool can be diverted to underground pipes. These pipes run the full length of the pool and empty just at the base of the waterfall. This way the pool could be drained and then, while empty, cleaned completely each season. You really only get a sense of the size of it when you see these two 6-foot-tall workers standing in the deep end. An underground pumping station also near the deep end provided irrigation for the ornamental gardens and was connected to fire plugs at the main house. In the years that followed, Vaucluse became famous for Diana Ryan's herd of prize-winning jerseys. Mrs. Ryan built large barns on the west side of Wapping Road. Vaucluse jerseys were highly acclaimed award winners, often setting national and international records. The immaculate condition of the Ryan barns and the care given the cattle were legendary. Diana Ryan lived at Vaucluse for nearly 40 years. She died there in 1977. Following Mrs. Ryan's death, the big house was never occupied again. The estate was sold in 1978 to a family long associated with the Newport summer community. The new owners opted to live in smaller buildings on the farm or built houses that were of a more manageable scale. In 1994, while vacant, the main house was set on fire by arsonists and burned beyond repair. The remains were demolished a short time later. Today, 3 siblings and their families share the roughly 220 remaining acres. The farm is beautifully maintained and the owners have incorporated organic farming and beekeeping into their plans for Vaucluse. They have also established conservation easements on the entire property so that it will remain undeveloped open space. In the late 1990s, a landscape historian named Alan Emmett wrote an entertaining essay about the gardens at Vaucluse. In her conclusions, she searched for elements of the earlier landscapes. Emmett noted that, quote, the sycamore in the glen may have been planted by Samuel Elam. Giant beeches, locusts, and linden all survived from Shepherd Tom's day. But somehow Mrs. Emmett missed the fragments of boxwood, descendants of the ancient maize that grow randomly around the ravine, as well as several old saguaro cypress trees that were almost certainly planted in the 1860s. There are also wych elms, part of an old allée planted by the Hazards. And there are 2 ancient Rhode Island greening apple trees now barely alive that miraculously survived from Shepherd Tom's day. I hope I've been able to give you a sense of just how different things were in Shepherd Tom's day. I often wonder what Shepherd Tom would think of Vaucluse and our modern world if he returned today. No doubt he would be saddened by some of the changes and losses at Vaucluse over the last century and a half. But I feel he would be heartened to see his family graves maintained and protected by the new owners. I believe he would also be pleased by their careful stewardship of the farm, their thoughtful attention to the landscape, their commitment to preserving open space, and their focus on improving our island community. I believe Shepherd Tom would be less shocked by this modern world than we might realize. I'm certain that he would readily accept the improvements in modern medicine, all of which would have saved his wife and daughters from their early deaths. And I bet he'd prefer crossing the Atlantic in 7 hours rather than 20 days. I also suspect he would be genuinely thrilled with modern communication and not just the telephone and television. I feel certain that Shepherd Tom would be instantly enamored by Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Keep in mind, he sent scores of articles, sometimes daily, to newspapers and magazines for publications. He self-published dozens of books and pamphlets. He kept himself in the limelight and he wanted to be heard. He was, by modern definition, a prolific blogger and an important social influencer. Wherever Shepherd Tom is, I'm certain that if we could commune with him, he would find some way to let us know that he is pleased that his world is not completely forgotten and reassured that it still has some meaning, even if only for the small group assembled here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. If anyone has any questions for John, you can raise your virtual hand by using the hand signal that you will find at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, or you can unmute yourself and tell us that you have a question. And I see a question from Mary. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah. Hi. I might have missed it, but does Van Kloos mean something in the name? Where does the name Van Kloos come from? Now, what does it
It's
mean?
Vaucluse, it's named after a part of a place in France near Avignon. And a 14th century Italian poet lived there. And the owner of Vaucluse in the 18th century fancied himself the modern day version, the 18th century version of this poet. So he named the place Vaucluse after Petrarch, the poet's house.
Oh, cool. That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
I have a question. I want to thank you for this really interesting talk. It was fascinating to hear
thank
about
you.
this. This property. I'm a librarian at Peacedale Library across the street from the
Yes,
museum.
you have a wonderful collection, and I've given you credit for many of the photos that I used tonight.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, one of the things we have is a diary of Joseph, Thomas's brother. And the diary covers a lot of aspects of Joseph's life. He mentions, various aspects of his spiritual experience. A lot of it, though, it's about his expenses and his travel, and it's not really dominated by his spiritual experiences. But Joseph, as you probably know, built a castle in Narragansett where he also hosted seances, and Joseph plotted out a cemetery near the castle where he planned to be buried. And he built himself a giant tombstone that he had made out of, I think, westerly granite and engraved. And there are photographs of it that we have at the library and on the library website. So the cemetery is still there, and it's marked as a Rhode Island Historical Cemetery. It's on Gibson Avenue in Narragansett. Nobody's buried there. And Joseph is not buried there. He is buried at Vaucluse with Thomas's family and their parents. And the mystery is what happened to Joseph's tombstone that he took such care to put up and expense. And, why did he end up buried over here with such a modest gravestone? Do you know the answer to any of those?
I don't. First of all, this right here, this one white stone is Joseph's stone.
Oh, okay.
And I don't, other than maybe he decided, maybe, who knows? He was such an unusual person, and he had so many strange ideas. His watch, as you know from his diaries, talked to him for years, and he may have been told by the spirits to be with his family, or may have thought there was a better opportunity for him to commune in his afterlife at Vaucluse rather than alone in Narragansett. I haven't found any information that specifies it. He died after Shepherd Tom, as you know, so but I'm not really sure, but that's Joseph right there. That one white
Okay,
stone.
thank you. Did you take that picture of the cemetery? Because I haven't found any online that are.
I did. This is my
of that
photo.
view. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a question?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I was curious if you could tell me anything more about Phyllis. Was she a servant? Was she a descendant from a former slave?
I think Phyllis was enslaved to his grandfather decided that he didn't want to keep slaves early on. And there's quite a bit about that in Shepherd Tom's writings, in both Recollections of Olden Times and also in the Johnny Cake Papers. You have to read them. I mean, they're just fascinating. And the descriptions of her are incredible. They're just whimsical and charming and totally made up. So I don't know how much of Phyllis is actual fact and how much is fantasy. But she was definitely, the Hazards all kept slaves, but they tried to free them or include them in their sort of their farming operations much earlier than other people in the state.
Okay, thank you. This
Thank
is
you.
a great talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question?
I have one more question.
Sure.
Do you know if Thomas had slaves at Vaucluse on that farm?
No, he did not. It
Oh.
was well past. He was an ardent, abolitionist, and it was well past the time, 1837, when he bought
Okay.
the farm, was well past the time of slavery in Rhode Island. I know that he had trouble keeping staff because a lot of the household staff in the days were Irish and Catholic, and he had written a couple of discourses against the Catholic Church. And at that time, it was, they weren't well received. And so he had a little difficulty maintaining some of the staff there or attracting staff. But if you look through the census records in the 19th century, it's pretty easy to define. I wish I had more time to get into all of this, but you can actually track the number of people that lived at the farm and worked for him through the census records every 10 years.
Okay.
Anyone else have a question?
Anyone, Karen?
I don't see any.
Well, thank you.
Wait a minute, Martha does. Go
Okay.
ahead, Martha.
Hey, Martha.
I just was clapping.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that was
Yeah.
an applause, okay. Sorry
Yeah.
about
It
that.
was very enjoyable.
Yeah, he's great.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Is this all, I can't see it, is this, this is a thumbs up, okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Was this recorded so that
Yes, it was.
okay, good. So we can go back and watch it again
You'll
or,
be able to, yeah, in a few days, you'll be able to see it on YouTube through a link that will be posted on our website.
wonderful. Thank you. It was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for a fascinating and insightful presentation. And my hope, and I think everyone else's, would be for you to come back with a part 2 with all your research. And I would like to thank Karen as our Zoom master and everyone else. It's just so nice to see everybody. And we look forward to our next series, which will be in the fall. So good night, everyone. Stay
Thank you,
safe.
everybody.
Go ahead, Karen.
I said thank you to everyone.
Yeah, and thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
And
you for inviting me.
yeah, great job, John. And have a great summer. And we'll see everyone in the fall.
All right.
Oh.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
offering
Thanks,
this
Jen.
program.
We can clap for John now.
Thank you.
See you again.
Okay. Clap.
See you soon.
clap.